So, welcome to Catholic Philosophy, an introductory seminar. We're going to begin by going back in time to 369 BC. Theodorus is a math tutor. He has just introduced his student Theaetetus to an elderly Socrates. And Socrates is questioning Theaetetus with the aim of getting at a definition of knowledge. And after showing that knowledge, the definition of knowledge can't just be indicated by examples like geometry, arithmetic, or astronomy. Socrates proceeds to explain why knowledge also just can't be sense perception. Theaetetus is having difficulty keeping up with the argument and remarks that his head is swimming when he tries to contemplate these matters, to which Socrates replies, "I see, my dear Theaetetus, that Theodorus had a true insight into your nature when he said that you were a philosopher. For wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder." But philosophical wonder is wonder of a particular kind. The Catholic philosopher Kenneth T. Gallagher puts it this way: philosophical wonder is not primarily before the complicated and abstruse, but before the simple, the obvious, the close at hand. But although it begins with the obvious, it is, says Gallagher, as if it begins with a distancing of the obvious, an endeavor to retain the immediacy of the questioned datum while bathing it in an aura of absolute strangeness. So there's this double aspect of something that is right there, something that seems quite simple and intelligible. And yet in another way, there's something about it that strikes us as being beyond our grasp, perhaps even hopelessly beyond our grasp. I remember a time several years ago, I was driving through my neighborhood on a nice sunny spring day. And as I drove past the elementary school, the breeze brought a swarm of maple samaras to my windshield. And I'd grown up seeing these samaras and playing with them, or helicopters as we called them, like you see in the picture here, just throwing them up in the air and watching them float to the ground. But at that moment in the car, it suddenly seemed so marvelous. These little seed carriers, which possessed a nature capable of growing into a magnificent tree, but in this case were just doomed to be trampled on the pavement. And at that time, I was drawn into a desire to understand more of the nature of these samaras and how they fit into the grand design of the universe. Maybe you've had a similar moment or of wonder that ignited the desire to know more. St. Thomas tells us that wonder is indeed a desire, a kind of desire for knowledge, a desire which comes to man when he sees an effect of which the cause either is unknown to him or surpasses his knowledge or faculty of understanding. That, by the way, is the first of many quotes from the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas, and you'll be hearing much more from him over the next several weeks, and hopefully gain the tools to read his work yourself. So let's look a little bit more about this wonder and where it leads. A few minutes ago, we heard from Plato. Now we are going to hear from his greatest student, Aristotle. At the beginning of his investigation of metaphysics, which we'll get to look at in a little bit more detail in about 3 weeks, I think, Aristotle discusses the final aim of wonder. It is necessary, however, he says, for the possession of wisdom to settle for us in a certain way into the opposite of the strivings with which it began. For everyone begins, as we are saying, from wondering, but it is necessary to end in what is opposite and better. So we're not meant to keep wondering about the same thing. Wonder drives us to investigate and eventually finds its repose in knowledge. Now, in the normal course of things, this simply gives way to a new wonder that looks beyond this new knowledge, which in one way contemplates and satisfies the wonder we had before, but in another way is incomplete in that it points to yet another cause beyond itself. The Catechism of the Catholic Church recognizes this as an ultimate yearning for God. At the very beginning of the section on prayer, it teaches us that man is in search of God. In the act of creation, God calls every being from nothingness into existence. Even after losing through his sin his likeness to God, man remains an image of his creator and retains the desire for the one who calls him into existence. St. Augustine puts it very personally in his Confessions. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So we can see here clearly the twofold nature of wonder. Wonder is a beginning, but it begins because in some way we are aware of the end without quite grasping it. It's a beginning not just at the beginning of our life, but at any point in our life when we recognize that there is something behind the given. Think of what is given to us as the effect of a cause, and there is a beginning of wonder. As St. Thomas says, there resides in every man a natural desire to know the cause of any effect which he sees, and thence arises wonder in men. So wonder is a search for knowledge of a cause. But St. Thomas explains again why in this life, our knowledge of anything, including God, is inadequate. He says, if therefore the human intellect, knowing the essence of some created effect, knows no more of God than that he is, the perfection of that intellect does not yet reach simply the first cause, but there remains in it the natural desire to seek the cause. Wherefore it is not yet perfectly happy. So let's break this down a bit. We can know of God through his effects. The precise proof for this is something we'll get to much later, but for now you can take my word for it. Although I imagine if you're in this seminar, you don't need to take my word for it that God exists. But you may need to take my word for it that you can prove the existence of God from reason. But these effects, the effects that we use to prove the existence of God, are not sufficient to reveal his full essence. All that it tells us is that he exists. In other words, it tells us that he is, as St. Thomas said in the part I just read. It doesn't tell us what he is, in other words, his essence. So no matter how much we know of God through his effects in this life, the desire always remains for more. St. Thomas continues, consequently, for perfect happiness, the intellect needs to reach the very essence of the first cause. And thus it will have its perfection through union with God, as with that object in which alone man's happiness consists. Now we know the end of wonder. The end of wonder is union with God, contemplation of God's essence, direct knowledge of him. And this is the true end of all philosophical wonder. And being the end, it's also the beginning. So over the next 2.5 months, we're going to be following the various paths that human reason, impelled by wonder, has traversed. Along the way, we'll touch on all the major fields of philosophy: logic, which is you can think of as the study of right thinking; epistemology, the study of knowledge; philosophy of nature; metaphysics, which is the study of being itself; philosophical psychology and the human soul; ethics; moral theology; natural theology, which is theology without divine revelation. We'll also look into the history of philosophy, especially as it pertains to the Catholic tradition from the ancients on up to modern times. We will have half of a session on the philosophy of Pope St. John Paul II and how he tapped the philosophical method called phenomenology to present the Catholic faith in a new way through his theology of the body. Finally, we will take several of the concepts we learn about on the way and see how we can apply them to central Catholic doctrines such as the Trinity, the person of Christ, and the sacraments. So for each session, I'll give a presentation for about an hour, usually with a few breaks for questions. And then for a second hour, if you like, you can stay for a discussion on the topics of the day, or if those aren't interesting enough, any other matters pertaining to Catholic philosophy. Just a brief note about myself. I'm primarily a musician by education. It's only relatively recently that I've turned to studying philosophy, and currently I'm pursuing a master's in philosophy with a concentration in the history of philosophy. I'm offering this seminar because I enjoy teaching and discussing philosophy, also because I want to learn the material better, and because I thought this would be a good opportunity for adult catechesis in the parish. Since I'm still rather early in my studies, there will be a lot of matters that I'm not well versed in. And if questions about those come up, I'll let you know. And hopefully we'll be able to find the answers. But I believe that I do know enough to give a good introductory presentation like this seminar. Also, today's opening presentation may go longer than an hour thanks to this introductory material and additional content. And before we jump into things, I want to show you one other thing here. So this is the responses I got from you about what your interests are. Let's see, the ones that are incomplete, modern and contemporary philosophy, and then philosophical influences on the New Testament. This is interesting. This was the most interest was in this matter. It also happens to be, of all the things on here, the least thing that I know anything about, but I will do my best to do research on that before we get to it, which will be in a few weeks. How to read St. Thomas. Yep, I expected a lot would be interested in phenomenology. So let's see, faith and reason, we're going to cover that today. All of these we'll get to in some way or another. I thought it was really interesting that happiness, only 2 people want happiness or want to learn about happiness, even though happiness is actually the one thing that everybody wants. Anyway, I just wanted to show you what the interests were of others who were here. And I think that as we go along, some of these things that maybe you didn't think you were interested in, you may find are really quite fascinating. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of the session for today. So 3 main tasks I want to look at. First, I'm going to give a survey of some of the main streams of philosophical thought that converged in St. Thomas Aquinas. Second, we are going to look at the main subject of philosophy, which is wisdom, and how philosophy is divided into different sciences, and exactly what the word science means there. Finally, we're going to look at the relationship between faith and reason through the lens of the encyclical by that name, written by Pope John Paul II. Also, please note that if you're following along the print-friendly presentation that I sent along with the Zoom information, I have made some changes to the presentation since that document was sent out. The main screens should all be in the same order, but the contents are a little different in some cases, and there are 1 or 2 screens that I've added. So before I dive into the subject of wisdom, which is what philosophy is really about, I want to impress on you how the intellectual lineage of St. Thomas Aquinas gives us a good argument for studying philosophy. I picked St. Thomas because even 750 years after his death, his theology is still the most complete, unified, systematic presentation of the Catholic faith. For centuries, it was the main foundation for theological formation in seminaries, and fortunately, that is still the case in many places. Thomistic theological language and conclusions are all throughout the writings of popes, councils, and the catechism. But St. Thomas didn't just think all these things up by sitting alone in a quiet room. He enters into a long intellectual lineage that stretches back to the foundations of Western philosophy long before Christianity. So let's take a look at those foundations. Western philosophy really springs out of ancient Athens in the person of Socrates. Socrates is in many ways a curious figure. For one thing, he did not leave us any writings. Since we depend on others, mainly Plato and to a lesser extent the ancient historian Xenophon, for information about Socrates, it can at times be difficult to determine what exactly he believed and what these authors want to make it seem like he believed. But what seems to be beyond dispute is that Socrates was a self-proclaimed social gadfly who would go around Athens challenging his fellow Athenians to think about and explain why they thought the things they thought and did the things they did. His method for discussion or dialectic is known as elenchus, which is a method of logical dialogue where one person would ask questions of another in order to draw out hidden presuppositions and come to a better understanding of the truth. Socrates was really good at helping people see what their hidden assumptions were and the often grave or nonsensical consequences of these assumptions. His focus was mainly on ethics and virtue. He was always trying to become a better person and better member of society and helping others to do the same. Really, his life, you could say, is one long investigation into the good life. He didn't really have any philosophical doctrines in the way of that philosophers would following him. It's often the case, and we'll see this. You'll see this if you read Plato's dialogues, that a lot of the dialogues that he has Socrates engaged in end without a certain conclusion. So we're going to discuss Socrates a little more in the next few weeks when we get to history of ancient philosophy. But for now, let's move on to Plato, who was a student of Socrates. Unlike Socrates, Plato did write philosophy, but he did so in the form of dialogues most of the time with Socrates as the main character. These dialogues would supposedly recreate the kinds of conversations that Socrates would have with his fellow Athenians. However, Plato added into these his own philosophical doctrines, which scholars believe extended far beyond the more limited ethical focus that Socrates had, and gone into the realm of metaphysics and epistemology. If you're a little bit concerned about not knowing some of these terms, I know some of us come from some of us have read quite a bit of theology or philosophy. I got this from the registration forms. Some have hardly read any. Don't worry about it. We'll get to everything. But two of the doctrines right now of Plato's that I want to mention are his Doctrine of Forms, also known as ideas, and his Doctrine of Knowledge by Recollection. So for Plato, the things that we see around us are really just bare shadows of the things that really exist. Those things that really exist are not made of matter, but are immaterial, perfect exemplars of the imperfect things that we see around us. So the perfect invisible things Plato calls forms, or sometimes translated as ideas, with a capital F or a capital I. And there are forms for all sorts of things. There's a form for a stick, there's a form for man, there's a form for houses. There are forms for virtues as well, like justice or prudence, and there are forms for mathematical objects like numbers or triangles. The source of all forms and the highest form is the form of the good itself. All of the things we see around us exist in the way they are by a kind of instantiation of several of these forms coming together imperfectly in one entity. So I have the form of man in me. I also have the form of baldness in me. And so that's one of many forms that converge all on me at the same time. So these forms also serve to unify all of the different instances of the same kind of thing into one. So let's explain that a little bit further. So I'm a man. Father Meng, our pastor, is also a man. Donald Trump is a man. Socrates is a man. And Attila the Hun is a man. And any other man you can think of. So we're all obviously very different and distinct and have our own unique being, but somehow we can all be called the same thing, man. And we like to think that being a man is not just an arbitrary label, but describes something that is really true about what we are. An arbitrary label, or more precisely, what we would say is a kind of nominal definition, would be something like, I define the word new to refer to anything made after the year 2010. There's no real reason, apart from it just being convenient for me, that the word new should have this definition. But we would like to think that being a man is different, that there's something essential that all men share that is not just dependent on what is convenient for me. And that thing that we all share is what philosophers call a universal. We'll get to universals more in a few weeks, but suffice it to say right now that Plato believed that universals, or the forms, as he called them, were real things unto themselves. That means that to Plato, there's a real form of man somewhere in the heaven of forms, And not only that, but this form of man exists even if no actual men exist, and even is more truly man than any particular man is. So connected with this is Plato's doctrine of recollection. He believed that all of us, before we are born, know the forms of everything in our soul, but that when we are born, we forget them, or they sort of recede into hidden parts of our mind or something like that. So then learning is not really coming to know something I didn't know before, but it's really just remembering what I had already known and just forgotten. Plato formed a school called the Academy, where he taught philosophy, the philosophy and method that he developed. His greatest student is Aristotle, who eventually also founded a school in Athens called the Lyceum. Aristotle had some deep disagreements with Plato, and I'll mention two that are important here, related to the doctrines of Plato I was just talking about. First, on the doctrine of forms, Aristotle says that forms do not exist apart from things. In other words, the form of man exists only because individual, actual men exist. Furthermore, there can't be any such thing as being more or less a man. Either you're a man or you're not. Therefore, the form, insofar as it is considered a universal, only includes whatever it is that all actual men have in common. Aristotle agrees that this is something immaterial, but it is an immaterial part of actual things, not an immaterial thing existing on its own. So second, about knowledge, Aristotle disagrees with Plato here as well. Plato says knowledge is recollection. Aristotle says that all knowledge comes first through the senses. Even knowledge of things that are not sensible, we can only come to know of them insofar as they have effects in the sensible world. And this is how Aristotle eventually is able to prove the existence of immaterial beings, particularly for our interest, God. So this different about knowledge is very important, and one that comes up all throughout the history of philosophy. The question is, what is the relationship between the world we immediately experience and the ultimate realities? For Plato, the visible world is a mere shadow of reality, and we have to go beyond it in contemplation, beyond what we merely experience in the senses. Aristotle, in contrast, validates the truth of the empirical world, the world of everyday experience. There's a classic painting of ancient philosophers by Raphael called The School of Athens. Here you can see the very center of that painting zoomed in. On the left is Plato, and he's pointing up to the sky as if pointing to the ultimate reality of the forms. And on the right is Aristotle with his hands stretched out over the ground, as if to say, no, Plato, this is reality. Truth comes through what we experience here in the senses. So a final note about Aristotle before we go on concerns the form of his philosophical writing. Aristotle's form of recording his thought was in the form of the philosophical treatise, in contrast to Plato's dialogues. Only a portion of what he actually wrote comes down to us. And scholars think that there are two bodies of writings from Aristotle, one that is referred to as exoteric, which would be designed for public consumption, and one that is called esoteric, not in the sense of being mystical, but in the sense of being reserved for his inner circle of students at the Lyceum. All of what we've received are the esoteric works, while the popular works are unfortunately believed to be lost. So the works are very technical, and if you look them up online and read a bit, you will see that. Okay, so let's go on to see what happens with Plato and Aristotle going forward. First with Plato. In the early centuries AD, a number of philosophers developed an interpretation of Plato that was highly mystical. These are referred to as the Neoplatonists. On the other hand, Neoplatonist thinkers were also familiar with some of Aristotle's works, and they were firmly convinced that Plato and Aristotle could be reconciled, in spite of things like the differences between them that I just mentioned. These were the philosophers who had actually the greatest influence on Augustine and other Christian philosophers such as Boethius and the author known as Pseudo-Dionysius. So let's take one example of how this could work and how it ended up with St. Thomas. So remember, we just talked about Plato's doctrines of forms and of recollection. Augustine taught something that's known now as divine illumination. And this is the belief that some of our ordinary knowledge comes not from our encounter with the world, but purely as a gratuitous gift from God. And this is just ordinary, everyday knowledge. St. Thomas Aquinas took this idea up in his own philosophy of mind, asserting that there is a part of the intellect which God must sustain in existence, and which is essential for the ordinary operation of our reasoning and knowing. Now hold on to that thought for a second while we turn to Aristotle. For centuries, most of Aristotle's works were completely lost to the West, with the exception of two of his logical works. However, his other works had been translated into Arabic in the Middle Ages and were actually being used by Muslim philosophers who were coming up with their own synthesis of Aristotle and Neoplatonism mixed with Muslim theology. When Europe finally recovered Aristotle, it also received translations of massive commentaries on Aristotle by Muslim philosophers such as Averroes and Avicenna. If you listen to my introductory video that's on the parish website, you might remember I mentioned that Aquinas refers to Aristotle as the philosopher with a capital P, and he refers to Averroes, the Muslim philosopher who wrote commentaries on Aristotle, as the commentator with a capital C. So Aquinas, throughout his works, both uses and refutes their arguments, while of course reading and commenting on Aristotle himself. So let's go back to this idea of divine illumination. Remember that we saw how Aristotle taught that all knowledge comes first through the senses. Aquinas takes this view up and confirms it, but he uses a small and rather vague and difficult to interpret part of Aristotle's treatise on the soul to find a way to preserve a kind of divine illumination. Aristotle talks about a part of the intellect called the active or agent intellect. Its operation is to take the image given to the mind by the senses, this is Aquinas' interpretation, to take the image given to the mind by the senses and to turn that into an intelligible form that can be impressed on the mind. This agent intellect is something created uniquely and directly by God for each individual person and enables us to use reason. However, it doesn't operate unless it has an image to work on from the senses. In other words, Aquinas finds a way to preserve both the idea that all knowledge comes through the senses and that we need a power given directly by God, which God sustains in existence for us in order to get something intelligible out of our sense data. Aquinas does this, of course, also with the guidance of sacred scripture and tradition. So, of course, he is thoroughly Catholic, but his philosophical lineage is important in determining how he elucidates the truths of the faith using the language and methods that he's received. Okay, we're going to pause now for questions before we go on. Let's see, for this question period, I think what I'll say is just, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask it. And if that ends up, as the seminar goes on, if that ends up being unmanageable, then we'll rein it in. So any questions?
Where are you studying for your master's?
I am working on my master's through Holy Apostles College and Seminary. So it is actually all distance learning. The school itself is in Connecticut.
Who runs the school?
Who runs the school?
Diocesan, is it religious order?
No, I think it's independent. Actually, my dad might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, it's an independent college, but it's under the bishop of, it's in Connecticut, Cromwell, Connecticut. It's under the local ordinary. It's very well known. For a time, it basically older seminarian people, second vocations. That was their primary seminary for many years. So I do have a question for you, John. How did we get Aristotle's writings from the Muslims?
So there was interaction between the Islamic philosophers and the European scholastics as well. So that was one way that the West started receiving the works of Aristotle. But at some point, and my off the top of my head, I can't tell you the history of it precisely, but we'll get to it when we get to medieval philosophy. It wasn't just through the Muslims that the West received Aristotle, but also got the original Greek so that it was translated into Greek, and it wasn't just filtered through these Muslim commentators. But yeah, when we get to that part, I'll have probably a little bit more detail about that.
Got it.
So I would be in the category who has not read much philosophy before, studied much philosophy. In high school, I did read the Allegory of the Cave, which from hearing this sounds like that's Plato. Is there
Yes.
a similar text that you might recommend that kind of summarizes Aristotle's teachings? Kind of like, I think that is probably a good summary of what you described about Plato.
Sure. So let's see, a good summary of Aristotle. We'll get to that in 2 weeks. I think it is in 2 weeks when we do the history of ancient philosophy.
Sounds good.
So, yeah. What she's referring to with Plato's Allegory of the Cave is in Plato's Republic, and it describes the situation of a philosopher who is emerging from the world of shadows into the world of pure forms, and then has to descend back into all of the rest of us who are still caught up in the shadows, and try to teach us that there's something, there's some ultimate good that is beyond what we recognize in front of us. But we'll definitely have to mention that when we talk about Plato a little bit more. Okay. All right. Well, let's go on from here. So now we're going to get to, I would say, really the real beginning of the seminar. So philosophy most pertains to wisdom. But in order to know what wisdom is, we need to look at human knowledge more generally. So you'll find the word science when you're reading St. Thomas or Aristotle, and it doesn't quite have the same more limited meaning that we understand it to have today. The word actually comes from the Latin verb sciere, to know. The participle form of that is sciens, knowing, and from this we get the abstract noun scientia, which is knowledge, or that which is known. So knowledge, scientia or science, is just that which is known, knowledge. But to move beyond this nominal definition, Aristotle provides a more complete essential definition. For we do not think that we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary conditions or first principles, and have carried our analysis as far as its simplest elements. So for Aristotle, science is in particular knowledge through causes. We think we know a thing when we know what causes it in various ways. Science understands the reasons for things. It understands the why and not just the what. In this sense, it ends up being a lot broader than the modern conception of science, which is primarily descriptive of just one type of cause. So let's take a look at this image, which illustrates Aristotle's causes in a very rough way. The formal cause you can think of for now as being kind of the shape or form that the thing takes. Now, in what sense this is a cause will become clearer when we get to the seminar on philosophy of nature and metaphysics. But for now, it's just important to understand that the formal cause is more like an active sustaining principle. Instead of a statue, think for the moment about an acorn, or maybe the samaras that I mentioned before, and how that can grow into a massive tree. The actual physical shape changes, but it is the same underlying nature all throughout the change. That's closer to what the formal cause is, that gives this one thing unity all throughout its lifetime, from being a seed to a sapling to a mature oak tree. So that's the formal cause. This is Aristotle's way of repurposing Plato's notion of forms that we discussed earlier. So the final cause is the purpose or the end. What's it for? Everything for Aristotle has a final cause, even, or perhaps especially, natural things. So the final cause of this statue is to be displayed in public. So the efficient cause, or as Aristotle calls it, the moving cause. This is what brings the change in something from what it is, in this case, a block, into being something else, in this case, a statue. So the efficient cause is the sculptor. He's the one that makes it happen. The material cause you can think of as being what it's made out of. In this case, marble or whatever that material happens to be. So modern science tends to concentrate on efficient and material causes. But for Aristotle, the most important causes are really the formal and the final. The formal cause is important because it really explains the underlying nature of something. And the final cause is important because it's the ultimate purpose of everything. Now, Aquinas considers science in two ways. In one way, objectively, based on the object or concept that is known. On the other hand, we can consider science subjectively, and in this way, it is an intellectual habit. So to illustrate this difference, let me introduce you to Doris. Doris is thinking about something. Specifically, she's thinking about the fender bender she got in yesterday. That was her fault when she ran a red light. Now, if we think about science based on just the cars and their operation and interaction, apart from how Doris is thinking about them, this is science considered objectively, thinking about the object of thought. It's looking at things that are known and their own natures. But if we ignore them and we look at Doris herself and her own act of knowing, science is an intellectual habit, according to Aquinas. But what is a good habit? A good habit is a virtue. So science is a kind of intellectual virtue. This chart here explains where science falls as an intellectual virtue. Aquinas distinguishes between intellectual virtues and moral virtues, which are, for instance, like humility or courage or patience. Moral virtues are virtues of doing things, and intellectual virtues are virtues of knowing things. Most of the time, we probably tend to think of virtue as being just moral virtue, but for Aristotle and Aquinas, it's a bit broader than that. So among the intellectual virtues, we have practical virtues and speculative virtues. Speculative virtue has to do with knowledge that we gain for its own sake, and practical knowledge is knowledge for the sake of some activity. So practical knowledge is knowledge that we could take in order to learn a skill, or that we can take back into our moral virtues to behave better, but knowledge that is for the purpose of acting. So speculative knowledge is knowledge for its own sake. Among the speculative virtues, then, there are three that Aquinas distinguishes. On one end, we have understanding. So for St. Thomas, understanding is knowledge of basic first principles that are self-evident. So examples of this are what's known as the principle of non-contradiction, which just says that the same thing can't be and not be in the same respect at the same time. In other words, I can't both be here at my desk and be not here at my desk at the same time. Other principles like this for the understanding would be principles like being. Nobody has to be taught that being in general exists. We experience being. We know of being innately, and it can't be proven without assuming it. Same with the principle of non-contradiction. You can't prove the principle of non-contradiction. You have to assume it in order to prove it. So that's at the very basic level, these very basic principles that we all have. Next up, there is science. Science, as we said, is an intellectual virtue whereby we come to know things through their causes. And then finally, there's wisdom. Wisdom is the knowledge of the absolute highest causes and first principles. It's a higher order of knowledge than science for reasons that we'll get into in a little bit. So let's go on and look at how these sciences can be divided up. Everything we look at during the seminar will basically fall into one of these categories or some combination of these categories. Aquinas divides the speculative sciences up in a way that corresponds both to things themselves and to our way of knowing them. The first kind of knowledge is based on things that depend on matter for their existence. Also, that depend on matter for us to know them. This is the world of sense objects. Consider, for example, Charlie Brown. Supposing Charlie Brown was real, he couldn't exist without matter. Also, we couldn't think of Charlie Brown without thinking about some concept of matter that makes him up, without thinking about his, say, yellow and black shirt and his very, very round head. Whenever you think about Charlie Brown, you have to include matter in some way in that thought. This is how all of the objects of physics or natural philosophy are. So physics doesn't mean the strict sense that we think of it today, but just philosophy of nature, philosophy of natural things, or natural science, or natural philosophy. Those are all interchangeable in terms of this field. So these things depend on matter, both for their existence, their being, and also for their being understood. Now, suppose you noticed, wow, Charlie Brown's head is really amazingly round. In fact, it's basically a perfect circle. Well, you could take the roundness of Charlie Brown's head and think about that circularity alone without thinking about any of the matter. So this is the next kind of science for Aquinas, mathematics. For any actual circles to exist, there must be material, there must be matter. You won't go out and find in the world circles that aren't material, except in the mind. So in our mind, we don't have to think about matter to think about a circle. You can close your eyes and think about a circle in your mind that has no matter attached to it. So mathematics for Aquinas is about things that depend on matter for their existence and also for their being understood. Mathematics depends on things that depend on matter for their existence, but not for their being understood. So numbers and shapes. Finally, there's the study of things that don't depend on matter for their existence or for their being understood. These are things like being itself, or notions of causality, unity, or the first principles, or even God. So all of these constitute the objects of metaphysics. None of these depend on matter for their being. When we're thinking about, for existence, being itself, this is called ontology. When we think about knowledge itself, this is called epistemology. If we're proving the existence of God from reason, this is called natural theology. All of these are part of the field called metaphysics. Now, if you go into a library these days and you go into the metaphysics section, it's going to be all this new agey stuff. So don't think that you can find good metaphysics going to your average library. Look up Aquinas or Aristotle. So now, apart from speculative science, there's also practical science. Like we saw before, practical science is knowledge directed toward action, and there are 3 levels of this. Ethics is what covers science pertaining to individual human actions, and we'll cover this in one seminar about halfway through. We will not really be looking at the other kinds of practical ethics, economics, and political philosophy, but I will put them up here just because they're part of the complete picture for the Thomistic Aristotelian science. Okay, before we go on, no, we've got one more here, and then I'll pause for questions. So now that we are 50 minutes into the first seminar, what exactly is philosophy? The word philosophy comes from 2 Greek words, philo and sophia. love and wisdom. So nominally, philosophy is love of wisdom. So it's going to be the pursuit of science pertaining to wisdom. As Aristotle tells us just what wisdom is. Wisdom, he says, deals with the first causes and principles of things. We can consider philosophy in a few different ways. One, as pursuit of any intellectual virtue in general, or science in particular, or especially what is most directed toward the search for wisdom. Therefore, in philosophy, we're looking for the highest and first principles of everything. The image you see here is, let's see, Gustave Doré's, one of his images from his series of images about the Divine Comedy. This is Dante looking into the circle of heaven, into that center is God. So Dante is looking into, he has this ascent to the highest causes and principles of everything. That's what wisdom is. So we should emphasize that modern science, again, considers philosophy often just to be just the study of reality that is separate from the natural sciences. But that is not the case. So consider the fact that all natural science is based on certain principles, for instance, principles like unity or causality. And these sciences can't prove their own principles. They have to get them from somewhere else. Natural science can't prove that there's such a thing as causality, for instance. So philosophy in the form of metaphysics is the study of those principles that all of the other sciences use. So philosophy is not a science separate from other sciences, but in a way really includes all knowledge in one way or another. Okay, now I'm going to pause for questions on this portion.
John, when you were talking about the division of sciences, you said that the practical sciences are directed toward action. What's like the one sentence or the one phrase summary for the speculative sciences?
The speculative sciences are knowledge for their own sake.
Thanks.
Knowledge for its own sake. I'm studying just to know this. Good. Okay.
Hello, John. This is Jason Tarosky.
Hi, Jason.
So you've been talking about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle as the fathers, essentially. Were there other philosophers at the time who had competing views, but throughout history we don't consider them relevant?
Yeah. So
fathers of not secondary, but fathers.
yeah. So there, it's often considered that Thales of Miletus was really the first Western philosopher. And he preceded Socrates, and there were several others that preceded Socrates as well. Pythagoras, for example, is one, and so we'll get a little bit more into them in 2 weeks when we look at ancient philosophy. But yeah, there was already a tradition that these philosophers fell in. And we see this in Aristotle. If you look at Aristotle's works, one thing he always starts off with doing is reviewing the history of philosophy before him. So he doesn't just lay out his doctrines as a lot of philosophers before him did, and a lot of philosophers still do, just ignoring the intellectual tradition. But he lays out all the beliefs about the topic he's going to consider. He says, okay, well, we're going to talk about what matter is, or what nature is, and here's what these philosophers thought about matter. And then he'll go on to say, and this is why all they said was wrong, but maybe we can keep this little part of it. Excuse me. And he ends up building on the philosophy that came before him. But yeah, they fell into a tradition, and there's quite a bit of other philosophy that that came after them. Of course, it doesn't just jump from Plato to or from Aristotle to the Neoplatonists to Augustine and to Aquinas. There's an incredible history there. And if anybody's interested in the history, I highly recommend to you the podcast, the History of Philosophy podcast. So if you just look up History of Philosophy podcast, it's really excellent. And there are several hundred episodes, and they're still in, I think, only up to about the 15th century. So there's quite a bit to cover. We won't cover all of that.
But most of the early pre-Socratic philosophers were Greek, though, weren't they? Or from what we have, we don't have anything that wasn't Greek, do we?
So we can also there are also traditions of Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy that are also pretty ancient. We're really focusing on Western philosophy because it's a pretty clear connection from.
That's a good point. Yeah, I forgot about the Chinese.
Yeah. The History of Philosophy podcast, by the way, does cover. I think they have a thread going on that went on Indian philosophy and another on African philosophy as well. Okay. Any other questions on this portion? Right. Oh, wrong way. Sorry about that. Okay, now for our final topic to cover today, faith and reason. It should be clear by now that there's a long tradition, both faith and reason have in Catholic thought. But in recent centuries, there's been a wall put up between these, as if you have to pick either to use reason or to use faith. So let's dig into this and see what exactly each of these are and how they work in concert. So the author of the letter to the Hebrews gives us the classic Christian definition of faith. I'm going to give you 4 different translations of it just because I think that altogether they give a more complete understanding than just one of them alone. So faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Or faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Or faith is the substance of things to be hoped for and the evidence of things that appear not. This is closest to how Aquinas would have understood it, although he also translates the word that is translated here as evidence also as conviction. Or finally, faith is that which gives substance to our hopes and which convinces us of things we cannot see. St. Thomas tells us that every virtue has a particular end or a purpose and a particular kind of matter. For matter, think, what is it made of? What is this virtue made of? Well, faith is made of the conviction of things that are not seen. And what is the end of faith? It's the realization or assurance of what we hope for. Now, in a theological virtue, St. Thomas tells us, the end and the matter are always the same. These come together in a special way. So faith as a virtue is when the happiness that we seek in God but do not have, and that's the end, that's what we hope for, is in some way made present to us, even though we do not have the evidence of reason to demonstrate it. So in our intellect, faith occupies, there's a certain way you can think of it as occupying a middle place between science and opinion. On the one hand, it gets a kind of uncertainty according to reason from the fact that reason does not comprehend or see it. On the other hand, what we believe by faith is absolutely certain because it's based on the authority of God, and there's no higher authority that we can take than God himself. When we know something according to science, remember that it was because we comprehend its causes. But with the objects of faith, our intellect does not comprehend the causes. It can't, at least in this life. So by an act of choice, we fix on the side of certainty. And it is the grace of God that gives us this ability. So if you think about reason being the natural way we know things, faith does not go against the natural way, but it builds on that. It gives us certainty by strengthening our conviction concerning the articles of faith. So faith is not irrational or unnatural, but it's supernatural. Now let's look at the other side of this. Let's look at reason. What exactly is reason? Reason is simply going from previous knowledge to new knowledge. A good way to think about reason with respect to knowledge is to compare it with sight. Consider for a minute the field of view at any one time. You could take in the whole thing in one picture, but reason doesn't work this way. Human reason takes one element here and another element and gradually puts them in order in a certain way to come up with something more complete. So we would say that reason is collative. It unfolds by an ordering of thought. Two general ways that reason can work, and which will come up throughout the seminar, are analysis and synthesis. Or we could also say an analytical approach or a synthetic approach. In analysis, we start with one concept and draw out all of its principles and contents. For example, if I were to start with the concept of a statue and start to elucidate for you all of the causes, principles, and constituent parts of the statue, that would be analysis. In synthesis, we take many different things and bring them together into a unity. So if I were to start describing all of these different statues that I see, and then come up gradually with a concise summary of what all those statues are like, that would be a synthetic approach. So one final point here. Reason is a gift from God for us to come to know him through his works. The gradual way that reason works means that in a way it will always be incomplete. Whereas when we are with God in heaven, there is no working anything out by reason. There's no gradual coming to know him, but we know him directly, just like vision. St. Paul describes this beautifully. At present, we see indistinctly as in a mirror, but then face to face. At present, I know partially, then I shall know fully, as I am fully known. So now we have to know God through his causes, or through his effects, In the next life, we see God face to face. So now let's turn to Pope St. John Paul II and his encyclical on faith and reason from 1998. If you have the print-friendly version of the presentation, which I emailed along with the Zoom info, you'll see a link to the encyclical, along with a link to a really great summary written by the philosopher Fred Freddoso. And if you want to read Fides et Ratio, I recommend that you actually instead start with Professor Freddoso's summary. So let's take a look at the main points of this encyclical. He starts off with recognizing the basic human desire to know about ultimate being, about ultimate moral truth. The philosopher Immanuel Kant once said, and in fact, I think it might actually be inscribed on his tombstone, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. So all of us have that deep desire to know the ultimate principles that seem so mysterious, as well as the mystery of how we can know what goodness is and how to pursue it. The Pope goes on to assert the primacy of revelation and obedient faith. So there is nothing more certain than the fact that God is one God in three persons, and that the second person of the Trinity became man and died for our sins out of love in order to draw us into eternal communion with him. Then the Pope says that the results of reason can acquire true meaning only within a larger horizon of faith. Reason can go astray because of sin. If we decide that the ultimate good is, for instance, pleasure rather than God, then our theories of ethics are going to be completely off. Or I also think about St. Ignatius of Loyola's rules for the discernment of spirits, where he says that evil spirits can suggest false reasons that lead us astray. So even when it seems to us that reason can be operating perfectly, it is still prone to error. And when we get into logic a little bit coming up, we'll see some of the ways that happens. The Pope tells us that perfection does not consist in abstract knowledge that can be gained by thought alone, but in love. He says, what human reason seeks without knowing it is only in Christ. He offers a historical review of philosophy and a very fascinating analysis of its better and worse aspects, insofar as various schools of philosophy through the ages have approached or turned away from the truth. In this context, he asserts that it is the duty of the Church's magisterium to intervene when truths of the faith are threatened by false reasoning. Next, he turns to the interaction between theology and philosophy. Here he warns theology against ignoring philosophy, which focuses on universal principles, and getting too caught up in the social sciences, which concentrate on the particular. Not that the social sciences are bad, but that they're not it's not the primary task of theology insofar as it is a speculative science. As for philosophy itself, he warns that reason must never lose its capacity to question and be questioned. He rounds out the document with 3 tasks for philosophy. First, to recover its dimension of searching for meaning. And here he has in mind contemporary atheism and existentialism, which leads us to a loss of the ultimate meaning of life, reducing all of existence to pure deterministic forces of nature. Second, he says philosophy must verify the human capacity to know the truth. He has in mind the skeptical attitude, which is really prevalent now. Modern philosophy, ever since the 17th century, has struggled with the possibility that maybe we can't really know anything at all. But when we get to epistemology next week, we'll see why that is misguided. Finally, philosophy must recover metaphysics. Modern science has tried to reduce everything to empirical data, as if, well, not modern science per se, but those who advocate a kind of scientism, where the methods of science are held above everything else, reduce everything to empirical data, as if the only things that can be verified are what can be tested immediately through the senses or in natural science. But again, as we saw earlier, natural science cannot prove its own principles. Philosophy, says John Paul, must keep seeking higher, must keep approaching the absolute. Now, what about conflicts between faith and reason? Can there be conflicts? Consider on the one hand the truths that we grasp by faith, and on the other hand, the truths that we grasp through reason. Where do the truths of faith come from? Of course, they come from God. But what about truths grasped by reason? Remember that reason is also a gift from God. It comes from God. Both of these streams have God as their source, and they cannot be in conflict, because both of them can be resolved into God himself, who of course can't contradict himself. But someone might respond, it's clear that atheists have come up with arguments through reason proving that God doesn't exist. Well, here's what St. Thomas says about such perceived conflicts between faith and reason. We can respond, he says, in one of 2 ways. If possible, we can prove they are wrong. And as we'll see next week when we talk about logic, there are 3 ways to do this. One is by showing that they use a term ambiguously. For instance, they might use the term God to refer to different concepts at different parts of the argument. This happens sometimes. Another way is by showing that their argument is based on a false premise. For instance, if they rest part of their argument on the idea that God is part of the universe. A lot of arguments against God's existence implicitly have this premise built into them. Finally, we can show they're wrong by pointing out invalid reasoning or fallacies. But suppose we can't prove them wrong without resorting to or without consulting divine revelation. In this case, we can still show that their conclusions contrary to the faith are not necessary. For instance, Aristotle argued that the world is eternal. Aquinas, in his commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, demonstrates that Aristotle made an error in thinking that the world was necessarily eternal. And then he goes on to assert, according to an article of faith, that the world is not eternal, but was created by God. Another example is the soul. Someone might argue that perhaps there's something like a soul or an immaterial part of us, part of our mind, but that it goes out of existence when we die. However, it's impossible to prove this. So even if we can't convince someone that the human soul is eternal, as we believe, we can at least argue that it is not necessary to believe that the human soul goes out of existence after death. Okay, so we began talking about the concept of wonder and how that impels, how that drives philosophical investigation. It gave you a survey of some of the lines of thought going from the beginning of Western philosophy up to Aquinas. We talked about the sciences and wisdom and where philosophy fits in there, and then faith and reason.